Sandy, what are you doing? That's not the kind of pants thing we're talking about today. What are you? Oh God.
Wait, not this kind of panzer?
Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the Red Ink Writers podcast. My name is Sandy Butchers. I am the author and illustrator of the Singularian Grimoire anthologies on Patreon. I am a co-author of several Amazon best-selling anthologies, and I am currently in the query trenches with one of my full-length manuscripts.
And I'm Lydia Stevens, author of the Hellfire series and the Ginger Davenport escapades, and we're so excited for you to join us today.
Red Ink is proud to be an official sponsor of Hive, the nonprofit writing community providing free, inclusive events, programs, and resources for writers of all backgrounds. Did you know that they too have a podcast with all sorts of writing advice for both starting and advanced writers? Check out the Word Nerd Cafe at anchor.fm/wordnerdcafe podcast or click the link below in the description.
This week's episode is all about the greatest discussion that has ever made its way through to the writing community. And I'm not talking about whether you write by hand or type your stories. It also has nothing to do with self or traditional publishing. Today is all about the difference between pantsing and plotting your work, the pros and cons of each, and how to find out which fits your preferences best. But before we start, let's get one thing out of the way first. Sandy, are you a pantser or a plotter?
By nature, I would say I am definitely a pantser. Yeah, I don't know, I'm a slave to my brain. My brain comes up with the story, and all I have to do is keep up with the writing to actually write it down. Yeah. How about you? Because I think you are. I mean, I've known you for quite a while, and I kind of know that you are familiar with both. But what's your preference?
Yeah, so when I'm writing on my own work, I'm definitely a pantser. I get an idea in my head and then I just sit and write. And it's very funny. Usually I can sit and free write and pants my way through a story, but I don't really get sort of that drive or kind of almost like a manic focus until the last scene pops into my head. So it could be argued that that's a little bit of plotting, but I do know how to plot. And that was back in my freelance days of ghostwriting. I would either write the plot for somebody or they would send me a plot and then I'd have to write the story. So I do know how to plot. But personally, I definitely prefer pantsing because I feel restricted when I try to write to a plot. And my characters always surprise me when I'm pantsing, and that's
and we are just experiencing the same surprise, and that's what I personally like about it. Like my characters go like, oh, really? And I'm like, oh, really? So it's the exact same emotion. Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
I absolutely love when we're having a critique session and you're going through chapters and your comments and then trying to end a chapter on a hook, and I definitely get the surprise when the chapter ends and then seeing your seeing your comments when you read what I've written and oh my god, so that is I do love those. I would say that there everybody's a little bit of a pantser and a little bit of a plotter. I think we have a sort of like a dominant and recessive trait. I think, you and I are definitely pantsers when we write, but there's always that little bit of, how is the character going to get from point A to B to C? And we don't necessarily actively think about it, but I think it might be there. Just the same as with plotters. Every story has to start with an idea somewhere. And then somebody has to sit there and think up what the plot is going to be. So in that act, that's pantsing in their head. And then they're writing it down into a plot. So that is my argument, is that everybody can do a little bit of both, but we when we're actively writing in a manuscript, we lean towards one or the other.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Because I've also noticed that I can do both. And even though my initial setup is to be a pantser, I have also definitely experienced the benefits of plotting. And it's interesting that okay, so we've done some research obviously on this subject, and a lot of people say they enjoy the freedom of being a pantser, but they also enjoy the confidence of being a plotter. So I personally never experienced a lack of confidence while I was pantsing, although I do understand that people might feel confident because they know where they're going. It's like going on a vacation and you know your destination, or just getting in a car and going.
Yes, and I would caution one thing with pantsing. Pantsers, I feel, and I would advocate for, they need to be very aware that they're probably going to do more editing, and the reason and revisions, and the reason being is because we just let the story go, and it is come what may. You're writing it down. But then you're going back through and you're reading and you're thinking, okay, maybe they didn't need to go to the river to get water for the horse when they had, you know, a bucket of water over here by the covered wagon. You know, so you have to be very much aware that you could go off on tangents in your writing when you're pantsing, and they're not necessarily pertinent to the story. So you may find that you're doing a lot more revision than, say, someone who has fully plotted out the story and then they're just sitting and writing the scenes that they know work.
Although, on the other hand, if we're talking about, you know, the process taking up time, and this takes up time in editing, I do think that if you start plotting, time-wise, it is probably going to be the same, if not more, when you start plotting your whole project, because the plotting itself often takes up more time than actual writing of the thing. And I also know a lot of writers who are definitely plotters and in heart, and you know, everywhere, every fiber of their being is a plotter, and they can get lost in it. They plot, and that's like, I might even call it the Tolkien syndrome, because they just start writing appendix after appendix, and they just keep going on the notes, but they forget, you know, to write. So I'm not sure if one is better than the other. Like, of course, there are benefits for doing one over the other, especially if it's a personal preference. But time, for me, it's not really an argument to choose either one.
Right. Yes, I agree with that. To an extent, you can also be a loose plotter. One of the things that we talked about last week was writer's block, and I remember having that with a manuscript, and just sitting and trying to write in the story was just not working. And so I had to think about what was I stuck on, and I ended up doing just a paragraph for each chapter. So I think for the remaining 5 chapters that I had to write, and I think it maybe took me 10-20 minutes to do. And what that enabled me as a pantser to do is say, okay, so I have a tentative plot of what is going to happen next to kind of get her out of the situation that she's in, this particular character. And then whether or not I follow the rest of that plot, you know, that was up in the air. But for that single chapter to be able to sit and write a paragraph and say, okay, you know, she's stuck in Italy and in a canal with a motorcycle. How is she going to get her motorcycle out of the canal and back into hell? So that, you know, I honestly, I must have sat and racked my brain about it for a week, and I'm like, how would the motorcycle run, and how would she get it out of the canal? So I had to really think about and plot out how was she going to get out of this situation, and that was just conflict resolution. But I ended up plotting that out in just one paragraph. So plots don't necessarily have to be like an entire series Bible, which is something that I use for a series. That can also be argued as a plot. I personally use it to keep track of things like age, birth dates, hair, you know, physical characteristics, things like that, especially when writing a series. Because
you need to be consistent throughout the entire series. So that's obvious. So
it's a good reference. Could argue that that's plotting, but that is something that stays the same for me throughout the series. So I don't, you know, I don't change the story based on their character type.
Do you write that after you, for example, written the first book of that series? Because the funny thing is, I posted something on Twitter earlier this week where I created a timeline of events based on the stories that I'd written up until now. And I asked the question, what does that make me, pantser, plotter, or I mean, what would you name it? And then people unanimously said it makes you an editor. And I was like, okay, that totally, bypasses the subject. But I think there's a difference in making these story Bibles before you start writing, or
Right.
after you start writing them. What do you do?
Yeah, I think making the story Bible after you've written it, that isn't plotting your next story. That's just keeping track of your details.
Yeah.
There are plotting tools out there. I've seen countless plotting sheets in the industry from conferences and workshops and
Yes.
and I think one of the most basic ones has just been something that I did in a notebook, which was just give a brief overview of what this chapter is aiming to achieve. What is the goal of the chapter? What is the conflict of the chapter, and how is it going to be resolved in this scene or chapter? And and there are some that can get very detailed, and they make you break down every scene, and you're looking at every character who's in the scene and what their goals, their motivation, and their conflict is. But no, I think a series Bible being done after a series has been written, that is not plotting. That's just a track. I would call it a tracking sheet for a series. And yes, to an extent that leads to being an editor, because then when you're going through stories in the future, you can say, I have the hair color as brown in this story, and now it's blonde in this story. And so that's editing for congruency. So yeah.
So you just mentioned a couple of beat sheets, or cheat sheets, as we can also call them. I think the one that is most prominent in the writing community at this point is the Save the Cat beat sheet by Blake Snyder. And he has sort of slimmed down the whole story process into an Act 1, a catalyst. And then he calls it the fun and games period, and that's basically where the apprentice would start the training with the great magician, or when Bridget Jones starts to realize that she wants to work out and lose weight and go for the guy. So that's the fun and games part, and it runs up to the midpoint where the bad guy sort of closes in, and we start to feel the urgency of the story, which then runs into the all is lost. Like every book that is written according to the Save the Cat method will have this moment where everything is just terrible, like the whole world comes crashing down, and from there they make the final solution. Like they start making the final plan, they gather their allies, and they start going for that grand finale in the end. And personally, I've worked with this sheet, and it's a formula. And having said that, I also want to sort of touch on one of the cons for plotting. I've seen many people calling it mechanical or artificial or manufactured in a way. So it takes out the spirit of a story, and it doesn't necessarily have to happen. But there are a lot of people who say, if I plot my story, it becomes fake in a way. It becomes artificial. Does that make sense when I say it like that?
Yeah. Yes. I wouldn't say that. We have to be very careful here. I wouldn't say that's true for everybody. I know
absolutely. Yeah.
writers who are plotters, and they have phenomenal stories. And I think when people are saying that, it kind of makes me think of marketing trends in the industry and what's selling. And so something like this, a beat sheet like this, would definitely be very beneficial to someone who is, they're sort of gearing their story towards the market. And that's not to say that every plotter does that. So I want to make that very clear so that we don't offend anybody.
Absolutely. No, absolutely.
And there are just some people who need to be organized in how they write. That doesn't mean that they lose any bit of personal touch or flair to the story or anything like that. That is just their method. I personally feel very restricted, so I can completely understand and agree with what you're saying, which is why I'm a pantser. And something like this, I have never used this before, but just reading it, the opening and the catalyst and the fun and games and the bad guys and such. I would feel like I'm trapped in like almost like a rat in a maze. Like I have to stick to this maze to be able to get to the other side. But what I find when writing, the beauty of a story is that there's so many different ways that a story could go to get to the other side. So I don't ever want to restrict that in myself. You know, my personal author motto is "Feel your fire, let it feed your soul." So that really kind of plays into being a pantser, in that, you know, just when I sit and I am writing and I'm in the story and I'm feeling the story, I'm on fire. So, you know, and that's one of those beautiful things that, you know, just as I'm writing, let it go out of control and then see what I come up with. You know, and then I might come back and look at it and be like, oh, this is terrible. Or I might come back and look at it and be like, yes, this is, you know. So for me personally, something like this wouldn't work. But I can completely agree. And I know people who have used the Save the Cat method. And they're very successful at it. They're very successful writers in the industry. So, yeah, I would agree. Personally, and then professionally, I also understand the benefit and the you know, advantage that beat sheets like this could bring to the industry.
And just to be clear, the Save the Cat method is definitely not the only plotting method that is out there. It's just it's just one that you know has been popping up all the time within the writing community, and it really has become quite famous in a way. But if you start looking for plotting tips or plotting methods out there on the internet, there are definitely a lot more methods out there. So you just wanted to sort of clarify that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's so many resources for writers out there. So this is one that we know about, and a lot of people have had success for it. So we definitely like to promote that, you know, here in the podcast. So
absolutely.
Yeah, and all you have to do is Google is your friend. So, you know, if you're looking for just a quick beat sheet, you know, Google plotting beat sheet.
And let us also refer to HIVE, because they have a really good bunch of editors out there who have tons of experience with the plotting and the whole structure of how to write an actual book. So, you know, HIVE is definitely also a place where you can keep an eye out for tips on how to plot if you feel like you are a plotter. Yeah. Red Ink is opening the doors to their virtual studio for fellow writers and members of the writing community. Do you want to have your book promoted, or would you like to be interviewed about your work? That is now possible. On our brand new website, redinkwriters.com, we have a continuous raffle going on that you can enter to, you know, win either a free book promotion, or perhaps you even get an invitation to join us on the show. This week, we'd like to show you Near Death, the second novel from Richard Wall, author of the acclaimed Amazon #1 bestseller Fat Man Blues. Near Death brings you the story of prison chaplain John Henry Beauregard, who gives the last rites to Joseph Hickey, a psychopath sentenced to death for killing a family in New York State. After witnessing Hickey's execution, John Henry quits his job and moves to a nice little cabin in the Appalachian Mountains in South Carolina. Soon after, another family is murdered in identical circumstances, and John Henry is drawn into a mystery that has devastating consequences and leads to a showdown where his life and soul are at stake. Now, I'm not gonna lie here, this sounds like a very intriguing book, so if you are as curious as I am, be sure to click that Amazon link below in the descriptions.
Hey everyone, it's me, Lydia. I'm here for the Intern Insights portion of the podcast. Today we are going to be talking about rejections, specifically those query letters that we send out and we either receive the form letter, no response at all, or on the rare occasion we do get some great feedback. And so there are 3 P words to rejections that I want you to be considering, and that is patience, perseverance, and problem solving. So if you saw on Twitter the portion of the Intern Insights patience, the query process is a long process. And that's not just for the writer, but for the agent as well. They're getting hundreds of query letters every single week. So, when you send your query letter and you don't receive a response for 3 to 6 months, and Lord knows I have received a response on a query, a rejection, a year after I sent the query letter. So that is to kind of give you an idea of just how flooded the inboxes are of these agents. So it's not that they are purposely ignoring your specific query. That is the nature of how the query process goes. So if you're querying a high-end agent, they're very sought after. It could take 6 months for you to get a response, and that is just how slow the industry works. So you need to have patience with the agents. And I know it's very easy to kind of get into our own head and be like, they just ignored my query, and yet that's not always the case. Okay, so be patient. The other part of that patience is you need to be patient with yourself. So if you've queried 10 agents out of, say 300 who rep fantasy, okay, and you're getting rejections on those 10, that doesn't mean that your work is not going to find a home with an agent. It just means that 10 out of 300, for whatever reason, cannot rep this particular story. It doesn't mean that the story is bad, okay? So one of the things that you need to remember when you're looking at your query is if you're getting a lot of form rejections or no response at all, say, 8 out of the 10 of those rejections were form rejections, it could simply be a matter of preference. The agent is passing on your story just because there was something they just didn't connect with. That doesn't mean that the story is bad or that the writing is bad. It just means it's just not right for that agent. So be patient in the query process. They say to query in tiers. So pick your top, pick 10 agents, query those 10. Wait to get back 60 to 70% of responses, and then query the next 10. Okay, so you should have a really good size query pool of agents that you could potentially reach, and you want to query them in the tiers. It's a long process. So if you're saying you're waiting for those responses to come back on the first 10 and it's going to take 3 months, this process should take a long time. So you need to be patient. The other thing that you need to do is persevere. So, it's been 3 months and you've got back 8 rejections in the style of a form rejection, 2 are a no response. Don't get disheartened by that, because like I said, you still have, and I can't do the maths, but 290 more agents to query. So give yourself the time to feel the sting of rejection, because we all feel that, and it hurts and it's horrible and we don't like it. Give yourself a couple of days to get over that. Just because you're getting the form letter or no response at all, like I said, I will always reiterate this, that does not mean that your writing is bad. It just means it's just not a good fit for that agent. A little bit later, we'll start to talk about the story might just not be a good fit for the market, and that is something different. So keep at it with the queries. Let yourself feel that little sting of rejection, and then say, because what's going to happen is the more rejections you get, you can look at this in a positive way. The more rejections you get, the more you're going to learn. And this falls into the problem solving that we're going to talk about in just a minute. What you need to be looking for is are you getting personalized feedback? If you start getting, several agents saying the same thing of, they're just not connecting with the character, then maybe you need to take a look at the character that they're talking about. Maybe they're saying, your story is great, but the setting needs to be a little bit more developed. Maybe you need to start taking a look at the setting. And I'm not talking after the first 10 agents. I'm talking about if you're starting to get, you've queried like 30, 40 agents and you've got, 5 or 6 have come back and said the same thing. Then you need to consider, what do I need to revise in that story? So you need to persevere in not just the query process, but in how you handle the rejection, because it's not easy to be told no, but learn from the no. Learn that there's something here, whether it's just the story is just not working for those agents, or it's just not a good fit for the market. So this is now where we're in the problem solving. And how do you handle the rejection? And that goes back to, you know, is it something you need to look at in the story? You know, once you're into like the 100th agent that you've queried and it's a form rejection or it's no response at all, take a look at marketing trends, because that could be how you problem solve. Maybe this story just isn't right for the market at this time. If you're not getting a lot of personal feedback from agents, maybe have an editor, you know, not your close friend, not your mom, an editor take a look at this story who's in the industry, and maybe have them, you know, could you take a look at the first 10 pages of my story and see, is there something that's just not working for, you know, because typically when you query an agent, they'll ask for the first 5 to 10 pages. So you need to be able to hook them with that. And if you're getting those rejections, you know, there's a good chance that maybe it's something there that needs to be looked at. So with rejections, I think if you make it a positive learning experience, then it can be a good thing. The query process should be a good thing for you, because you should be learning something from it. And not just, my writing's awful, nobody wants my work, you know, that's just beating yourself up. And that goes back to that perseverance of, you need to have a positive attitude that you're going to find your place in this industry. And it is a big industry. Like I said, they're getting hundreds of query letters weekly. So you need to have the one that stands out. And you may have to consider your query letter is what's not working. A really good resource is Janet Reed's Query Shark. I love that one. It's hysterical. I go when I'm feeling down about my own queries and rejections, and I sit and I read her blogs, and they are absolutely hilarious. So I recommend that resource. And, you know, visit the How to Write a Query Letter workshops. Take those classes. You know, rewrite your query letter 10, 20 times. Use the GMC method that we talked about last week. Use the 4-question method that we talked about last week. And let this process and the rejections really build your resolve as a writer to be able to get it right and to finally get that yes. All it takes is the one yes. So again, patience, persevere, problem solve, and you've got the query process, and you can handle the rejections. You've got this. This week's Twitter poll asked what subject people were most eager to hear about, and we gave 3 choices: plotting strategies, pantsing a series, and the myth of plantsting. Twitter has spoken, and the most popular subject coming from the community was the myth of plantsting. So Sandy, can you explain what plantsting is before we get into whether it's a myth or not?
Absolutely. Plantsing is a sort of gray area between being an absolute pantser or being an absolute plotter. There are a lot of people who believe they are plantsers because they write down a brief outline of what they want to do, and then dive into the story and just go wherever they want to go as long as they reach that point B. So you could explain it as having a point A and a point B, and maybe a point A and a half and A and 3/4 in between, and then just go through it. Now, I personally think that by definition, the idea of being a plantser does not exist, and I'll tell you why. If you are a pantser, you do everything on the go. If you are a plotter, you think of what you want to do in advance. If you are a plantser, you are thinking about what you want to do in advance. So by definition, that would make you a plotter. And that is why we played with the choice here and saying it's a myth. Being a plantser is a total myth, because it will make you, at least in my opinion, a plotter.
Oh, okay. I'm going to disagree with you just a little bit, because I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier. That as a pantser, I go into a story with the idea that I'm just going to sit and write, and then there might be something that really snags the writing, and I have to stop and I have to go in and say, okay, how am I going to get out of this? Or what is it about this scene that I don't know? So this kind of brings in when you're writing a story, and say you have to do research for a story. In my first novel, Highway to Hell, I really played around a lot with Dante's Inferno. And I had to read the book, and I had to study the author, Dante Alighieri, and really understand what Dante's Inferno was about in order to kind of reimagine the 9 circles of hell. So that was a lot of research before I began writing, but I never really wrote it down. I just read it. So is that research then plotting, or was the idea of I'm going to do a retelling of Dante's Inferno and then sit and write it, was that plotting versus where you get an idea in your head and then you just sit and write, or you free write with it? So yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
it's so subjective on how we define ourselves and what we label ourselves in terms of pantser, plotter, or plantster. So I think that I disagree with you in a little bit in that those self-identifying labels, they are what we make of them and how we define ourselves.
Yeah, and I'm just playing the devil's advocate here because we live in a society where you are one or the other. You're calling it that on the self-labeling. This is exactly why I said this, because this is a conversation that people need to have with themselves. Like, how do I want to label myself? And for example, doing research for me is not part of plotting, because doing research gives you all kinds of information, and even while free writing you can always fall back on that information. And it doesn't mean that you can't write anything down. It just means that you are not gonna consider what's gonna happen at a later on in the stage when you are a pantser. So definitely, and that's why I keep calling it a gray area. This is absolutely 100% debatable. If the planter thing is a myth, if it's true, if it's possible. So this was just me trying to poke around a little bit and see, what I could get from you and what I can get from, the viewers as well. So please feel free to drop your opinion below in some comments and let us know what you think about being a pantser or a plotter, or the magical thing in between, which is called a planter.
Yeah. So let me ask, why do you think it's a myth? Why specifically, if you could maybe narrow down, we talked about the definition of what it might be. So why do you think it's a myth?
Well, basically because of what I just said. Like, if you follow the definition of a planter, you lean towards being a plotter, because the moment you start thinking about what is going to happen in your story, you are basically plotting. So that would make it impossible for you to also be a little bit of a pantser, because you are at that moment plotting. But this is if you look at the definition very strictly. So that's just, for the sake of this episode, this is what I'm going to stand with. If you are a pantser, you have difficulties choosing between either one of them.
That's fair. That's definitely fair. I'm the shower planter, I think. Then I'll have to give myself that label, because I'll be soaping it up with the suds and stuff, and I'm like, oh, that's a really good idea, and then all of a sudden I'm off writing in my head, and I go to sit down at the computer and I have no idea what it was I was thinking about, but
but then you still keep on writing, so you're still a pantser, because what you came up with, it was brilliant and it made sense in every possible way, but you didn't write it down and you forgot about it, and so you dive back into the writing with a clean sheet, basically. So then you would be pantsing again. But in the case that you are in the shower and you have your waterproof notebook in there, and you're gonna go, oh, this is a brilliant idea, and you're gonna scribble it down while I'm washing my hair and doing all the things at the same time, you are a plotter. And there is no such thing as going, okay, so I wrote down this note on my waterproof notebook, gonna sit back on my computer, and I'm gonna work this out, so I'm a planter because I didn't fully write it down. No, you just plotted something, so you are a plotter, not a planter.
Okay, so your argument is that a plotter will write it down, a pantser will not, and a plantster is somebody who has the idea and, they toy with, do I write it down to write it down or not to write it down? I think
that is the question
here, but
and we are turning into philosophy podcast.
No, it's that hard line of, did you write it down or not? And as the sticky note queen, I'm going to say I have more than one occasion planted instead of pantsed. And I think I will still disagree with you a little bit here. I think that plotter, plantster, pantser are all different hats that we can put on and take off depending on where we are in the writing process. And that's the beauty and the fluidity of writing and this process, is that we can be one thing or another. And that is why I love writing so much, because we can be anyone or anything in our stories as well. And we get to be a pirate one day, and we get to be an alien the next day, depending on the story we're writing. And as writers ourselves, we get to be plotters, plantsters, or pantsers, and that's great.
I love the analogy of looking at these things as characters as well. Today we step into the character of being the pantser, and tomorrow I'm going to step into the character of being a plotter. I love that.
It's like the Three Stooges of writing.
Oh, yeah. Oh, perfect. I love that.
Larry, Curly, and Moe, only plotter, plantster, and pantser. And I'm gonna, with our 3 P words today, I'm gonna pa.
Exactly. So say that in a row like 3 times. Pantser, plotter, planter. Ha.
Patience, perseverance, and problem solving.
Oh, we have a lot of P's today.
Yeah, we do. So I think, yes, I will reiterate that I think that these labels are self-identifiers, and there is no right or wrong as to what you are. I think that's very important to state. So listeners, please know that whether you're a plotter, you're a pantser, you're a plantster, you're house plant, whatever you want to call yourself, we are here for it all. And this is just to help you maybe understand why you write the way that you write, so that you can improve on your craft. So I think that's the most important lesson here, is understanding what a plotter does, what a pantser does, what a plantster does, and then how to apply that to your own method of writing. And there is no right or wrong. So.
No, absolutely. And I think the reason we talk about this so extensively is also because if you feel like you're stuck with your writing, this might also be one of the things to look into. Mm-hmm. So if you are a free writer, or you're a pantser, and you feel like you're getting stuck, which is pretty notorious for being a pantser. Pantsers tend to get stuck more often than plotters. Mm-hmm. It might be your cue to start looking into plotting your novel if you feel like you keep running into that wall. And the other way around as well. So if you feel like you're stuck with your writing, because you feel it's also artificial and mechanical and preset, and you feel like you're just following the formula, go back to some free writing. So this is definitely the reason why we wanted to touch on this subject today, because this might be of help on moments where the writing doesn't automatically go.
Exactly. I 100% agree. So use these labels to your advantage, and to really, bring out the most in your craft, and work around those kinks in terms of getting writer's block and being stuck. So definitely agree. I 100% agree on that.
All right, well, that's it again for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Red Ink Writers podcast. And if you like what you saw, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and do hit that bell button so you won't miss any of our new premieres on YouTube, of course. Also, we will have a new Twitter poll on our brand new website, redinkwriters.com. So do head on over there to make sure you vote. Our next episode will be about the dreaded imposter syndrome. So we're going to have plenty to talk about then. And in the meantime, you've got this, even if you don't know what the fuck you're doing.